Krista Faye Creations presents Earth's Second Chance by Krista Faye. Dedicated to Roberta. Date 4632. Swirls of dust curl about the barren sun-baked ground as a small craft skips across wind-worn flat rocks and a dried-up riverbed, carving through black soot and ash that scar the terrain, where once a majestic forest stood proudly. Now littered with sun-bleached animal bones, the craft continues its search. Hovering quietly over the bones, its mechanical arm maneuvering to collect an assortment of DNA from each one. Moments later, a second craft joins the first. Its main purpose, to electronically scan the landscape and the depths below. It dips and skirts the first craft, then continues, whipping along the void riverbed following its dried-up meandering path. Slowing to a hover at the base of a large mountain rock formation, a laser slowly extends from the craft's lower section. It begins to drill into the rock, deep into its base, until moisture slowly bubbles up and spills forth from its stone-encased cage. Continuing deeper, the liquid becomes stronger, beginning to flow down into the dry riverbed and pooling there slowly before it begins to trickle along the millennia-starved river. The craft stops its drilling to collect a sample of the liquid. Once done, it turns back to rejoin the first, still at work. The two crafts continue their exploration along the surface of the dead planet, both stopping at a pair of flat rocks, so weather-worn and aged only the slightest lettering can be made out. Beloved husband. Beloved wife. Unsure what the markings mean, the second craft scans the area and detects traces of DNA 6 feet under the rocks. Communicating this to the first craft, they both begin another excavation on this new site, collecting ground samples at each foot of depth, marveling at the change of color and texture each sample presents. Instead of offering answers about this third planet from the sun, it only brings about more questions. Questions this space-traveling race may never know the answers to, yet seek to learn. The DNA samples are finally reached, collected, labeled with the same markings as on the rocks, then stored along with the soil samples. Done for this light cycle, both crafts return to the main ship where the samples are transferred to the data laboratories to be separated and analyzed. Each DNA collection is added to the many rows of others, found and stored in a compartment that opens from the wall of this larger craft. Date 4633. They return to the planet, once again following the course traveled the year before. Again scanning the surface and taking samples. As the light source lowers towards the west, they come to the last site and are surprised by the difference in the terrain. Both crafts come to a stop, hovering midair as the colors of the ground cover welcome them. The greens topping the rocks in the riverbed, surrounded by the blues of the liquid that encircles them, gently lap against them, creating a frothy white foam to add to the beauty. Liquids that continually move, dancing along the winding course of the river. The reds and yellows of growth on the riverbanks, with leaves of the deepest greens, bend slightly in the breeze. Winged specks flying from one blossom to the next, seeming to dance above them, land then take wing again. With a brief communication of lights, the two crafts return to their work. Again collecting samples, scanning the ground, and now trying to collect a sample of each growth and insect. Breaking off from the first craft, the second follows the course of the winding riverbed now filled with this liquid. Again, scanning the terrain and marveling at the changes it's undergone. Even the mountain rock formation has changed. A split high at its tip now spills forth with a soft roar of liquid that tumbles and falls down its face in a cascading blanket of white froth. A damp mist hangs in the air about the falls, reflecting vibrant arcs of colors above the ground. The craft scans and records these phenomena with intensity, then begins collecting samples of the air, mist, and falling liquid, before it turns and rejoins its brethren craft to continue its last leg of this light cycle. With growing excitement, both small crafts soon leave the planet to return to the main ship. Unaware of the meteor storm the main ship is caught in, large formations of solid rock beat into the ship, buckling and breaking its outer shell. Immediately after, another meteor's direct hit severs the ship in two. Both halves beginning to fall straight towards the planet, a trail of terrain samples, assorted DNA, microorganisms, and liquids following in its wake. mixing and merging as it falls, conjoining together as it comes to rest on the new growth of the planet's surface. Shaken when the two parts of the main ship nearly crash into them, the smaller crafts take evasive actions. Once clear of any impact, they return to the planet's surface, coming to a hover over the main ship. It's concluded with growing alarm, they won't be returning home this time. Coming in and landing, the suited creatures emerge to study the damage. Each fully understanding, they can't survive in this planet's atmosphere, unless the main craft is fixed. Quickly they begin the long and laborious job of joining the two halves of the main ship together again, in hope of it offering them a home base on this strange planet. Returning to their smaller crafts, the first hastens to use the mechanical claw arm, pushing the two large pieces together, while the second uses the laser to weld and seal the main craft's outer framework. Taking up residence, they watch as the season changes from the safety of the repaired craft. Watching as brown sticks slowly thicken and sprout more growth. Extensions grow upwards, becoming a new layering of green buds, and the atmosphere warms. As it does, the buds expand and open into assorted sizes and shapes that creates an overhead canopy of lush greens. Shadows are cast onto the planet's surface, where the roots gnarl and burrow deeper into the soil. Assorted fruits and seeds begin to appear as the climate continues to warm, while insects are spotted, wanting to take shade from the rising heat cast down from the intensifying light source. Newer patches of growth also begin to sprout from the ground, in the lighted patches that surround the first. Tiny shoots of green slowly expands away from the center hive of liquid that first appeared. The sky, too, has taken on a constant flow of activity, as wisps of white drift overhead. Some days, even blocking out the light source, becoming a thick dark looming that hangs heavy, or begins to leak. Sending droplets of liquid falling down, to create damp areas on both the new growth and the barren dried land. Each time the sky leaks, the ever-expanding growth of the planet's surface becomes active in its own way. Craters fill with the liquid, and that in turn sets off another growth spurt of activity, as long dormant seeds and pods are nourished and become active from deep within the soil. All this is noted and recorded by the pair, as they come to the conclusion that the liquid is the key element to this planet's continued survival. When the days begin to cool, bushes and trees, weighed down by ripe fruits, berries, and seeds, all begin to droop. A short time later, they fall from the cradle of the branches that gave them life and sustenance. The leaves begin to change colors, turning the surrounding area into a display of golds, reds, yellows, and browns. Some even litter the ground cover, having fallen from above to float down to the surface, then skip and play in the growing breezes. The days pass, as more fall silently from the branches, leaving them bare and forlorn in appearance. Then one day it happens. No longer does the sky leak that life-giving liquid. Instead, tiny particles of ice fall, blanketing the ground in a layer of thick white. Panic grips the pair within their craft, as even the ground formations of liquid start to harden, turning into a slippery solid. Fearing the planet is reverting back into its desolate, barren state, they hurry to their laboratory and begin to recreate the lushness they witnessed with the collected samples, once again retrieved from the planet's surface. Passing many months of cold wind whipping torrents and white ice particles, as they splice strands of DNA, molecules, and microorganisms together. Each are carefully placed in containers of soil, then given the life-giving liquid. Their attempts continually failing, until they are joined with the second and third key elements, which is discovered quite by accident. On a windless day, as the light source rises bright and warm, the two carry out armloads of failed attempts to dispose of them. Creating piles of unusable waste, made up of decomposing and dying plants, earth, and leaves, along with unsalvageable molecules, microorganisms, and DNA. They turn, heading back to the main craft to retrieve more. One of the plants, having struggled for oxygen, perks up as both the warm sunlight and the air feed it. Its roots, sinking lower into the compost pile. A few others in similar piles also begin to stand a bit taller. All leaning towards the sun as it climbs higher into the sky. When the alien pair return, they're met with a surprised state of the few plants, now taking on a stronger stance. Exchanging looks with each other, they begin to communicate their thoughts and theories, in a series of clicks. quickly coming to the conclusion that the planet's atmosphere must be what was missing in their attempts. With great care, the new deposits of experiments are placed on the ground, always taking time and consideration to ensure a dying plant rests center point in each. The day slowly comes to an end as the light source begins to lower and the wind picks up again, threatening to topple the new struggling growth. Ice particles begin to fall in a light dusting that turns the ground white again. The pair turn to each other in communication, working out a plan to protect the new plants, each looking around as darkness descends. Backstepping, to better assess the area, one steps in the solid covered crater and hears it cracking. Looking down, as the solid breaks and liquid seeps up through the gaps. Bending, the solid is retrieved, held up, and studied closely. It appears clear enough to allow the light source through and dense enough to block the cold wind. Both coming to the same conclusion, they hurry to their smaller crafts. Square sheets are quickly cut out, then lifted from the surface of the liquid, as both crafts work in unison, using the laser and the mechanical arm. The solid sheets are lifted and placed in an A-frame about the plant life. The laser turns and cuts one of the squares in half, and the rectangular pieces are carried over to finish the formation. The two pause, studying the ice shelter that allows the ventilation of the planet's atmosphere at its peak. Satisfied with the work, the occupants of both crafts return to the main ship and retire for the night. With the cresting of the light source, both head outside to examine how the structure fared the previous night. Inside the structure, the white covering has vanished. The plant life seems to be thriving, as they stand strong, sturdy, and vibrant green. The pair, delighted by what they see, clap each other on the back in an expression of, "A job well done." Each day is passed in this new fashion, as the aliens now brave the cold and ice to come study and record the constantly changing growth inside the clear solid structure. Both watching how the assorted plants, now blessed with tiny green buds, continue to grow. Movement in the soil is studied, just as a small pile of earth bubbles out, leaving a tiny hole opening that a creature, with a long tubular body and hydrostatic skeleton, crawls out. It slowly inches its way to a second plant, then digs into the earth and vanishes from sight. Turning, they marvel at the crater, as its liquid has once again formed into a solid. Brushing the white dusting off, they peer into the depths that curiously remain in liquid form. Specks seem to be growing there too, along with microorganisms swimming about. Every discovery in detail is recorded with great care. Slowly, the days begin to warm. Each day, the structure seems to be thinning, as droplets of liquid drip down the angled sides and nourish the soil. The buds, having grown 10 times in size, start to take on new colors and hues, as the green leaves that protected them in growth begins to fold away. Outside the structure, the white blanket of ice particles melts into puddles of slush, leaving bare ground patches in its wake. The liquid level in the riverbed appears higher, with chunks of ice racing along its winding course in record speed. Even the trees show signs of new growth, new leaf buds breaking out along the extended branches overhead. Suddenly, a silvery shimmer blurs the trunk of the nearest tree, expanding its base to twice its size for a moment. Then the spirit of the tree steps out, a feminine figure with a glow of silver that highlights her long length of waving hair. Pausing, long enough to look at the two outworld visitors, she bestows a blessing in the form of a nod to them, before she steps away to the surrounding trees to continue her work. As the warming days pass, the sky begins to leak again, sending torrents of its life-giving liquid to overflow the crater. A group of giggling water nymphs rise to the crater's surface. Splashing and playing, as they skip along the winding course, the overflow takes to merge with the rushing river, carrying along with them an assortment of plant life that took root and grew within the crater's basin. One spring morning, the soft velvety blossom of a pink flower opens, as the rays of the early morning sun breaks the blanket of the dark sky. Even the occupants of the repaired craft are awake at this hour, exploring the constantly changing landscape they've come to love. They stop to observe the flower with curiosity and amazement, knowing it to be one of the many that survived within the now vanished shelter. A tiny sound mingles with the sight, as a winged female figure yawns and stretches, in the warming light at the heart of the petals. Her flesh emitting a soft green-white glow as the sun rays reflect off the light covering of morning dew that clings to her. Scooping up a handful of nectar from the blossom, she drinks. A second flower opens to reveal a male, also winged and still fast asleep. Both alien creatures stand transfixed as they watch. With the light source continuing to rise, a dozen more of the flowers begin to open, each adding their spectral of colors ranging in soft violets, yellows, whites, blues, purples, and blushes of reds, throughout this sacred patch of earth. Each also revealing a tiny winged humanoid held closest to its heart, that range in a multitude of complementary colors. Standing at the base of her tree, bathed in her shimmering silver glow, the dryad smiles, as she watches over the grove. Her heart, swelling with the beauty of the sight. Her warm gaze lifts, to meet with the two-stranded pair. Her eyes twinkling in acceptance and gratitude, before she steps back into her tree and vanishes from sight. Returning from an exploration flight, to record the vast expansion of growth, one stormy summer night. Claps of bone-shattering sound seem to shake the very ground, and cracks of light split and streak through the dark sky overhead. The two small crafts hover over the bleak void terrain that marks this part of the perimeter. Observing as the large drops of liquid hit the loose granule ground cover that leaves in its wake small divots. Another thundering crash is heard, just as the sky brings forth a jagged bolt of light that comes straight towards them. It hits one craft and breaks into a trio of arcs that descend downwards to burrow into the sand. The second craft quickly begins to scan each burrow, detecting the hot shards of melted granules that slowly solidify into a translucent substance. Samples of each are quickly gathered before the two make their way back to the shelter of the main ship. Throughout the summer and long into the fall months, the two recreate the translucent substance, shaping and molding it into an A-frame to form an addition to the main craft. Once again, creating the ventilation openings for both the atmosphere and life sources of the planet to pass through at leisure. Date, 4638. 5 years later. The seasons pass as the years roll by. Large bodies of liquid build and soon separate the land masses, with more than half the planet now a hive of activity and the ever-spreading expansions of growth. The recreation of the plant life soon gives way to the reconstruction of animals. Using cells from the marrow of the assorted bones that once littered the dead planet, always brought about a curious and new result. Some feathered, with beaks and standing on two talon-styled thin legs. Most of these would extend their wings and fly out of the openings. One winged specimen stood out from the rest, with its heart-disked white feathered face and quick-eyed stare, intent on watching the two as they work. When a small, long-tailed rodent scampers across the ground and began to dig at the base of the wall in an attempt to escape, the owl spread its wings wide and silently glided down to capture it with his sharp talons. By nightfall, it too leaves, taking up residence in the hollow of a nearby tree, remaining close to the never-ending supply of food coming from the laboratory. Others, so large that with a swing of a trunk, horn, or twist of a body, the glass walls would break and they too wandered off. Still, the pair didn't stop trying, as the glass was replaced and animal after animal was reintroduced to the planet. Inside the glass laboratory, the two work intently on the clones. They grow from the last particles of DNA from wife and husband beloved. Each marveling at the new growth of limbs now forming. Clicking and clucking to each other in communication as more questions arise. Never answers, always more questions. A sound outside draws their attention, and hurried steps carry them swiftly outdoors. They meet with a curious sight. A pair of winged birds trill at a four-legged, one-toed, hoofed mammal with an extended humanoid torso, arms, and head that extends from its neck. Long hair falls down its back as it runs through the forest growth. Another fine example of the alien pair's handiwork, recreated from the gathering of the fragments, DNA, and molecules recovered from the main craft's crash years ago. They search the forest and spot the centaur's mate, standing guard near the newest addition to the family, who pounces and plays in the river water as it tries to catch a young mermaid, splashing him with a flick of her scaled, soft aqua-hued tail. Out for a stroll one night, the craft pair are communicating with each other, in a series of clicks and clucks, when they happen upon it. The sky, a blanket of sparkling light without a cloud in sight, is outshined by the glowing new moon that takes center point. It's there, in the clearing of the forest, where the spores are ramped to grow in intricate patterns and colors. They're spotted in some sort of ritual dance. Stopping, the two occupants quietly shield themselves behind a sturdy tree trunk to observe the tiny winged creatures curiously. She's glowing, a yellow hue radiating from her as she twirls between the mushroom stems. Her fingertips brushing the growth in a delicate caress as she moves past them. In the blink of an eye, she takes to the skies. Her delicate wispy wings spread wide as she rides an air current upward. He joins her, never touching, in a flight of chase that mimics her movements in harmony and beauty. Throughout the night, the two dart through the clearing, returning to the sky in a display of gentle colors streaking against the darkened background. Each, bathed in a heat-building intensity that seems endless. As the moon lowers, she falters and seems to fall earthbound right past him. He dives down in a spiral, catching up with her, and with just the tip of his wing, he straightens her flight, as the dance continues, taking them both back to the ground. Bathed in a ray of the rising sunlight, she stands. Her arms outstretched, the breeze caressing her with its warm touch. Her wings unfold and she softly coos, the wind current is caught, beginning to lift her from the ground. Strands of her long flowing hair dance about her, as she rises in a slow revolving circle. He appears by her side again, still glowing the blue hues that are highlighted by the layer of perspiration he worked up through the night's mating dance. His wings, folded tight, his feet firmly planted on the ground, as a hand wraps about her tiny ankle. Hand over hand, he draws her back down until he's able to pull her into his tender embrace. She softly cries out, fingertips lovingly weaving through his chest hair. Her head, cradled on his shoulder. Taking in his scent, his allure, she holds nothing back. He has won this mating flight, and she surrenders all to him. The alien pair quietly back away, heading back towards the main ship, pleased in the knowledge that even the tiniest of the planet's life beings will continue. They meet with another surprising sight, as the dryad awaits them, holding 3 large hollowed nutshells. Each filled with a tinted and aroma-fragrant liquid. Welcoming them closer with the warmth and caring radiance that sparkles in her eyes. She alone noticing how the planet's atmosphere has taken its toll on the outworlders. How their pale gray complexions have now turned ashen white, and their movements continue to slow. She smiles, as each are handed one of the planet's most precious gifts. Lifting the third to her own lips, she silently drinks with them. Watching as their complexions quickly darken, and they each bow respectfully to her. Then she turns, returning to her tree and becoming one with it. Feeling refreshed and vitalized from the drink, the two continue back to the main ship and their work. Several months later, as critters scamper about, small in size and with assorted short coats of brown, black, or gray. Large bushy tails, longer than both head and body combined, extend and twitch as they dart about the ground. Others jump from limb to limb of the tree branches, now ablaze with red, yellow, and orange leaves. One sits, balanced on its hind haunches, its forelegs holding a freshly fallen hard-shelled seed from the tree. Its jaws and strong teeth, gnawing through the shell to expose the tender soft meat encased within. Smaller cousins to these also frolic in the forest on this day. Smaller in structure and size. With lighter brown coats, and 2 distinct black lines traveling from the back of their head and down along their back. Unlike the first, their tails are short nubs, with a white fur underside. All scampering stops, as a strong, hearty wail breaks the natural sounds of the forest. All heads turn towards the sound coming from the metallic craft. It's soon joined by a second, softer cry. A cry they all seem to recognize instinctively as hunger. Thoughts of play are quickly forgotten, as the creatures of this planet begin to gather assorted food offerings. A small pile of assorted nuts begins to build outside the main ship, as the squirrels and chipmunks place them. Small birds fly down and make another pile of berries and seeds, near the first. Larger birds wing in with fresh caught fish, they drop into yet another pile. Offerings to welcome the 2 human infants into the world. The magical story dust begins to fade as it thins, and drifts down to burn away in the small flickering fire. The circles of young imps, fae, merfolk, pixies, and nymphs, each staring in awe as the images vanish.
These are the teachings of our creation.
The older fae softly informs them, as she stands and begins to gather up her supplies.
Class dismissed.
She adds with a smile, when none of the younglings move. Instantly they're on their feet and scamper off to play, leaving one young lone pixie girl to stare up at her and ask,
"Where are they now?"
Setting her supplies on the ground, the fae wings over and stands before the young one. Gently she touches the girl's shoulder and answers softly,
"That's a story for another day."
The fairy watches, as the young one skips off to join the others in play, then turns, as her mate lands next to her, his wings enveloping her tenderly.
"It's time,"
he whispers into her ear. When she nods slowly, he releases her from his winged embrace and the two take flight into the sky, towards the sacred flower grove. Each plucking a single bloom, before their flight carries them onwards, to the awaiting trio, made up of the two, now young adult humans, and the shimmering dryad, that stand, encircling a pair of time-smooth large flat rocks. Each fae rests a flower bloom on each rock, then lands to finish the circle. Lifting a large hollowed-out shell mug to the sky, the dryad pauses, as the humans mirror her actions. Each sip the liquid, then pour the remainder onto the ground, between the two rocks, unifying them all, and honoring the outworld visitors that restored the planet on the anniversary of their passing. A minute of silence is given, before each turns away, to return to home or task that awaits them, all vowing to never forget.